All right. Well, that's a pretty cool screen. Wow, neat. Anyway, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. Looking at a 2017 Nissan Sentra. This thing has the MR8DE four-cylinder. Um, this is a crank no start. And what I mean by crank no start, it does crank. It seems to crank normally. The cadence sounds good. It simply won't start. I have no backfiring, no try to start, no nothing. It'll just crank the full 8 seconds, turn off, crank the full 8 seconds, and sounds perfectly fine. It almost sounds like it's out of fuel. But I wouldn't be doing this post if it were out of fuel. So we get the thing in. I had to charge the battery. So usually when these things are no start, somebody's gonna crank the battery dead. The scan tool was no help because if there were anything in there, it was erased or gone. So we're starting over from scratch. So I pulled the number one spark plug out, and I look down in the cylinder, and I see no fuel ponding. The top of the piston seemed nice and dry, so I'm assuming it's not getting fuel. I also checked the spark. I like to use the spark plug itself, not a test light or a screwdriver. I like to see if the coil can actually fire the plug it's intended to. So I did a real quick crank, and I had no spark, and at this point I'm assuming no fuel, because on a no spark situation, if it were spraying fuel, you would get a lot of puddling on top of the piston, and it would smell, and the plug would be wet. But I had none of that. So I decided while I had the plug out, I'm going to go ahead and put my WPS in the cylinder. And whenever I have scenarios of no spark, no fuel, any combination of either one, I like to look at inputs first and foremost. Just either get it figured out that the inputs are good and in time, or if it's not, then go a different direction. So that's what I've done. So we got a WPS in the cylinder. I've got crankshaft sensor in red, camshaft sensor in blue. This little case study is going to be about a couple things. One is this car, and two, a little bit of using the software within Pico to kind of help you out. I work on a lot of Nissan vehicles, and it did not take me but 1 second to figure out what was wrong with this once I zoom in, and I'll show you. So I'm trying to present this to people that may not work on Nissan every day. Maybe this is the first Nissan you ever get in your shop. So the problem may not be as obvious to you. It could be the first time you've ever seen a cam and crank correlation on a Nissan. Especially this is a kind of a later model. So if you're a Nissan tech, you're probably going to go aha and just click off the video. But that's cool. So got this thing cranking. As I said, it cranks perfectly fine. It sounds normal. And you can see if I drop a cursor down, your first hit is a little bit high, but once the engine starts its cycle, I mean, you can see that thing is cranking really even. We got 186 PSI, but you can't complain about that. So got my cam and my crank, so I'm gonna just zoom in here. We'll do a couple engine cycles and we'll look. Now what I have done is I've got a couple of filters activated. You can see the check mark right there. If I turn this off, you'll see how kind of hairy the signal gets. It's kind of a byproduct of a cranking, because you got a lot of energy going through the starter. You got a lot of stuff going on that kind of would throw you off. So I add a little bit of filter to it just to clean the signals up. And this is where I knew I didn't know exactly what was wrong with the car, but I knew which direction I was going to go. But I'm going to just go through the paces here is what we're looking at. First off, the cam and crank signal, they're present. They're there. This is a standard signal, 1, 3, 4, 2. That's I don't know if Nissan did that on purpose, but that's the firing order of the engine, is 1, 3, 4, 2. I usually see the falling edges of the first one in each sequence fall in the gap or somewhere around the gap. And you got to watch some of the new cars that have the intermediate lock solenoid. They advance the cam 10 degrees for cold start. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. So I knew just by looking at this, why, let's zoom in just a little tighter here. Why is this falling edge literally in the middle of the gap, and this falling edge, inboard a tooth, and then this one is in the gap? That's not right. I never see this. And the other thing is that really sticks out, and this is where working on Nissans for years that I have, and looking at literally probably thousands of crank waveforms, I can tell just by looking, there is more teeth here than it is here. This gap is wider than this gap. And experience tells me that that is not normal. Here's a little tip when using the software. You can sit here and count all these, and that's not a bad count to do. It's not many there. But if you just do this real quick, let's zoom in on this one. And let's put a ruler out here. Let's put it, you got to kind of be precise with this, and I'll tell you why. And let's put it a little bit past the falling edge there. And I'm going to show you how to make a measurement. So we'll go down here at the bottom, measurement plus. We want to add a measurement. We want it to be on channel B. So let's go here. Let's go B. And what kind of measurement do we want to make? I want to do a falling edge count. And do I want to do hole trace? I can if I want, but I really just want to count what's between the rulers. So I'm going to go between rulers. That's why I put the rulers out first, because if you didn't, then you'd have to hit cancel, put the rulers out, and then start over. But I've been down that road before. So we'll go between rulers, and we hit OK, and boom. There are 13 falling edges right here. Now, granted, you could count them, and there are 13. But let's say if you were looking at a distributor signal that has 180, this little software comes in handy. So let's go 13. Let's back up. Just by eyeing it, this sequence has more. So let's do the same procedure here. We'll bring our ruler over. And we'll bring our ruler over. I'm going to go just a little past, because remember, I'm telling it to count falling edges. So if I go here, it won't count that edge. If I go on it, it depends on how picky the software is. So I'm just going to go a little past it, so that way I know it counts it. Just a little tip that I've figured out from doing these. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do, we're measuring channel B. And there's all kinds of stuff in here you can measure. I just typically use falling edge. You can do edge count, which will check each edge. So you just have to remember whatever number it spits up, divide it in half. But we'll just stick with falling edge. And once again, we're going to go between rulers. And we're going to hit OK. So 16. So this little sequence has 13, this is 16, this is 13, this is 16. Now I can tell you, this is where experience comes in. I have never seen a Nissan crank sequence in the modern era have different numbers in between the gaps. Now, some of our 6-cylinder motors have 10 gap, 10 gap, 10 gap, so on and so forth. I've seen 16 gap, 16 gap, 16 gap. I've seen 17 gap, but I've never seen 16, 13, 16. So I've got to figure, why is that doing that? And this is where more details, or details matter, come into play. And for an independent guy, who may look at this and go, well, that looks really nice and organized. It's 1613, 1613. So maybe the engineer made it like that. Well, let's look at through the whole capture here. Let's zoom in from the beginning. And let's just focus on the red trace. And just watch as I scroll through. And you're just scrolling through. And look at that. What happened right there? This happened to be one of the 13s. And all of a sudden it just kind of poked one extra in there. That would be a clue, as if you had never or had much experience with Nissan. That should be a clue to you right there. Why all of a sudden do I have that one little Joe poke sticking up? And I have no spark and I have no fuel. And the correlation is in time on the teeth that have 16. So at this point, I've got to pull the crank sensor out of this thing and look. I've got to look at the target wheel. I've got to look at the end of the crank sensor. So here's a little picture of what it looks like. This thing goes into the front of the engine block. You got your plug. Do not count these. This is a generic picture. Basically, there's your crankshaft. Your target wheel is riveted, bolted, bonded somehow to the crankshaft itself. And I did check. The only way to get that is to get a crankshaft. So I looked through the hole and I put a mark. I took a little marker and I marked a tooth. And I put my ratchet on the crankshaft bolt. And I'm rotating this motor around by hand while I'm looking through the hole. And I'm counting these teeth. I want to make sure there's 16 in a gap and 16 in a gap. Two clues. One, as I'm rotating this engine, it gets to a spot and the ratchet, I can't hardly push the ratchet. And I have to push it, then all of a sudden something just kind of breaks loose and then it spins around and then it goes all the way around and then it hits the same spot again and it breaks loose again. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? So I take the drive belt off the engine to make sure I don't have some sort of an alternator locking up or AC compressor or something. Even with the drive belt off, still the same scenario. The end of the crank sensor had no damage on it, so there was no like contact going on here. And I count exactly 16 teeth, a gap, 16 teeth, a gap. But my Pico capture clearly is showing 16 teeth, a big gap, 13 teeth, a big gap, 16. Just like in any investigation, as I start drilling down and getting closer to the answer, I start questioning some of the car's history. And I find out that the car had hit something in the road, I'm assuming, and knocked the oil filter off. And the car basically idled until it idled all the oil out of it and quit running and caused some sort of damage, I'm thinking, to the crank. So what I was able to do is, let me get back to my picture here. I stuck a screwdriver through the hole and I actually tried to turn it this way to see if I had any movement, like this was slipping. Did not. What I was able to do is the crank would move this way and it was getting out of the view or the magnetic field of the crank sensor, and it was losing 2 or 3 pulses. And the funny thing is if you crank this engine with the starter, it sounded perfect. It had no hitches in it. It did not, it didn't sound funny at all. And I mean, you can even see it, you know, if I zoom back out in the compression. I mean, that compression is nice and even. You know, usually if you got an engine that's cranking funny, you know, you'll usually see it in the compression waveform. The starter just had enough oomph just to wheels this thing over. Now, it was a freshly charged battery because the battery was dead when it came in. We zinced it up a little bit. I was not running it on a battery boost or anything because that really messes up a waveform. But cranking it by hand, it had a noticeable bad spot when turning the engine over. We were able to stick a pry bar in between the crank pulley, the balancer, however you want to call it, and you could get, I don't know what you call it, lateral movement. It's almost like the thrust bearing was eat out of the crank due to lack of oil. I mean, it was admitted that the engine was idled without an oil filter on it until it stopped. I guess once it cooled off, it unseized itself. Not sure. It was reported back to me that the oil pan got pulled and the damage was seen. I'm assuming an engine got put in the car. I don't know. Once I saw this issue here, seeing that the crank reluctor indeed had 16 teeth on it, and the movement in the crankshaft, and the fact it was ran without oil, I pretty much closed the case on this car. I thought it was neat. Like I said, once I saw this, I knew immediately which way to go. But I was thinking about some independent guys out there that may see this and assume it's perfectly normal because it's completely regimented. 16, 13, 16, 13, 16, 13, 16, you know. It's almost like it meant to be, except for that. That right there may have been your clue, or should have been your clue. That little guy right there, I guess the crank got back close enough for it to pick up one little blip on the short cycle. It made for a nice little detail. So that's my spiel on this. Interesting little case study. May have been trouble for somebody who, say, works on Fords all day and just happened to get this one. But for you Nissan guys out there, you probably could have picked up on this pretty quick. Thought it was interesting. Some engine damage. Of course, if you read up there, you probably would have seen bad engine. Kind of gave it away. But I am working on some new stuff. I've got a project going on. I'm working on some airflow deals. I'm trying to come up with some concrete evidence of using a mass airflow sensor to look at intake pumping. I was going to post something last week on it, but I've kind of raised more questions than I have answers, so I'm still working on that. So I will get that up as soon as I get a few answers to my own questions. I hate to put something up I'm not 100% sure about and confuse people more than need be. So, you guys beat the heat. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, hit the old thumbs up. Don't forget to share this stuff on any Facebook groups, other Nissan guys, Instagram. Share it with anybody. I put it out there for hopefully anybody to learn. Nice little tip with counting. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can kind of let the software do the counting for you. Now, this is not live. Well, I guess it is live a little bit. I would be careful with it. I personally, like, if I wanted to do another measurement, I would add another measurement because sometimes the live counting just isn't quite there. And if you want to do, like, take that one off, and of course you can add another one. But just be careful with it. It seems like it's live, but I've ran into a couple times where it wasn't. And also, another quick tip, if you have a lot of noise in here, like if I were to try to do this unfiltered, we'll say, that's not a tremendous amount of noise, but if it had a lot of noise in here, it may try to count the noise as a falling edge. So just kind of watch yourself on that. The software is only doing what it's being told. So if you've got a lot of noise or a lot of hash, it may count it and give you some weird numbers. So basically just kind of double check what you're looking at, especially if it's some odd looking number. Like we know that that does not look like if it were to come up with 50, just looking at that, you know there's not 50 there. So just kind of be leery of what you're doing, watch your step. But other than that, have a good one, and thanks for watching.